The gray silk of her dress was the only thing of value Lynn had left. It was a fine thing, meant for a wedding, with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs that her mother had stitched by candlelight thousands of miles away. Now it was snagged with burrs and stained with the dust of the Nevada Territory. It felt like a costume for a life that had been promised and then stolen in the space of a single afternoon. She huddled in the corner of the dark cabin, pressing herself against the rough-hewn pine logs, trying to make herself smaller than a shadow. The cabin was a desperate choice, the only shelter she'd found after 3 hours of stumbling through unfamiliar wilderness. The townsfolk in Argenta had watched her with hard, unwelcoming eyes after the man she was supposed to marry, a railroad agent named Mr. Sterling, had simply driven his wagon away from the station, leaving her standing alone on the platform with a small trunk and a heart full of cold dread. This cabin, set deep in a clutch of junipers, was said to belong to a man they called Graves, a gunslinger, a killer. The name was whispered with the kind of fear that left no room for curiosity. But the chimney was cold, the windows were dark, and a storm was gathering in the west, bruising the sky purple. A killer's empty cabin was safer than a town that looked at her like she was vermin. She had pried open a shutter and climbed through, her silk dress catching on the splintered wood. The air inside was stale, smelling of old wood smoke, leather, and something else. The metallic, lonely scent of a place long unoccupied. There was a stone hearth, a simple cot, a table with one chair. It was the barest sort of existence. She felt a tremor of safety, however fleeting. He was gone. She could rest here until the storm passed, then figure out what came next. But then she heard it. The soft crunch of a boot on the gravel outside. Lynn's breath froze in her throat. A horse snorted, the sound impossibly loud in the growing stillness before the rain. The jingle of a harness followed, then the heavy thud of footsteps on the porch. A key scraped in the lock. The door swung inward, flooding the dark room with the gray light of the dying day. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered. He paused, his head cocked as if sensing the air was different. He did not see her at first, tucked away in the deepest shadow beside the hearth. He stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him, and the cabin was plunged back into near darkness. She could hear him breathing, a slow, steady sound. He moved toward the table, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. A match rasped, and in the sudden flare of light she saw his face. It was not the face of a monster. It was lean and weathered, with lines etched around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and too little sleep. His gaze swept the room, methodical and missing nothing. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, found her. They stopped. The match burned down, scorching his fingertips, but he didn't flinch. He simply dropped it, and the darkness rushed back in, thicker than before. The only sounds were the rising wind outside and the frantic, silent beating of her own heart. She was trapped in the dark with the most feared man in the territory. His voice, when it came, was lower than she expected, rough like scraped stone. "You're in my house," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, holding no immediate threat, but no welcome either. Lynn could not find the words to answer. Her English was clumsy, a collection of phrases learned on a long sea voyage, and terror had stolen all of them. She pressed herself harder against the wall, the silk of her dress a useless, delicate shield. The man, Jonas Graves, did not move closer. He struck another match, and this time he used it to light the wick of a small kerosene lamp on the table. The golden light pushed back the shadows, revealing her fully. She was a small, frightened woman in a ridiculously fine dress, a ghost who didn't belong. He looked at the dress, then at her face, his expression unreadable. "The storm," she managed, the words a thin whisper. "I needed a place." He looked toward the window where the first fat drops of rain were beginning to smack against the glass. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Get away from the wall," he said, his voice still flat. "Come to the fire." He moved to the hearth, his steps measured and sure. He knelt, laying kindling with an economy of motion that was unnerving. He worked as if she wasn't there, as if finding a strange woman in his home was a common inconvenience. Lynn hesitated, her muscles locked with fear. He glanced over his shoulder. "The cold will get in those logs," he said. "You'll be frozen by morning." Therefore, she forced her legs to move. She crept forward inch by inch and sat on the braided rag rug he had gestured to, keeping as much distance as the small cabin would allow. The fire caught, its warmth a welcome shock against her chilled skin. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the flames and the drumming of rain on the roof. He took off his hat and set it on the table. He was younger than his reputation suggested, perhaps 35. There was no cruelty in his face, only a profound and settled weariness. He finally spoke again, his eyes on the fire. "Who are you running from?" "I am not running," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "I was left." He considered this. "There's a difference," he allowed. "Who left you?" "Mr. Sterling, from the railroad." Jonas Graves went very still. He turned his head slowly and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. A new light was in his eyes, something sharp and calculating. "Amos Sterling?" Lynn nodded, surprised he knew the name. "He was to be my husband." Jonas made a sound that was not quite a laugh, a dry, humorless rasp. "Sterling doesn't strike me as the marrying kind." He stood and walked to a small cupboard from which he took a tin plate and a piece of hard bread. He broke it in two and offered her a piece. She took it, her fingers trembling. It was the first kindness she had been shown since stepping off the train. She did not yet know that this small act had just sealed both their fates. The morning brought a clean, rain-washed world, but no peace. Just as Jonas was checking the cinch on his saddle, 3 riders appeared at the edge of the clearing. Lynn, watching from the doorway, recognized one immediately. Amos Sterling sat high on his horse, his face a mask of smug righteousness. The other 2 were hired men, their expressions mean and dull. Sterling's eyes flickered from Jonas to Lynn, a sneer twisting his lips. "Graves, I heard you'd taken in some stray property of mine." Jonas didn't rise to the bait. He finished tightening the strap before turning slowly to face them. His posture was relaxed, but his hands were empty and near his hips. "She's no one's property, Sterling." "She is my betrothed, bound by contract," Sterling announced, loud enough for any listening ears in the woods. "She ran off. I've come to collect her. The law is on my side." "Is that so?" Jonas's voice was dangerously mild. "Seems to me you're the one who ran off. Left her on a platform with every vulture in town circling." Sterling's face flushed. "That's a lie. She's a thief. She stole from me." He gestured to his men. "Get her." The 2 men dismounted, their movements slow and arrogant. They clearly believed Jonas Graves was just one man, and his reputation was probably more smoke than fire. It was a common mistake. They started toward the cabin porch. Lynn shrank back into the doorway, her heart pounding against her ribs. Jonas took 1 step to his left, placing himself squarely between them and the door. "That's far enough," he said, his voice dropping to a low command. The first man laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Or what, gunslinger? You gonna shoot us for retrieving what belongs to our boss?" He reached for Lynn. What happened next was not a gunshot. It was faster and quieter. Jonas moved with a sudden, brutal grace. He caught the man's outstretched arm, twisted it, and used his momentum to slam him face first into the porch post. There was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. The man crumpled to the ground, moaning, his nose a bloody ruin. The second man, stunned, fumbled for his pistol. Before his fingers could close around the handle, Jonas had closed the distance. He drove the heel of his hand up under the man's jaw. The man's head snapped back, his eyes rolled up, and he collapsed like a sack of grain. It was over in less than 5 seconds. Jonas stood over the two unconscious men, his chest rising and falling evenly. He hadn't even drawn his weapon. He looked up at Sterling, who had gone pale, his bravado vanishing like a puff of smoke. "You have a poor choice in hired help, Amos," Jonas said, his voice still level. "I suggest you take them and leave. And don't come back." Sterling stared, his mind struggling to catch up. The stories were true. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "This isn't over, Graves," he spat, his voice shaking. "You can't just steal a man's intended. There are laws. There are marshals." "You bring a marshal, you better bring an honest one," Jonas said. "Now get off my land." He took a step toward Sterling's horse. It was only a single step, but it was enough. Sterling yanked on his reins, his horse skittering backward. He grabbed the reins of his men's horses, and without another word he dragged the riderless animals away, leaving his hired thugs groaning in the dirt. Jonas watched him go, his face grim. He turned to Lynn, who was staring at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. He had not been a wild animal. He had been a craftsman, precise and devastatingly efficient. "He'll be back," Jonas said, his voice flat with certainty. "And he was right about one thing. He'll bring the law next time, claiming your stolen property." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something other than weariness in his eyes. It looked like regret. "You've stepped into my trouble now." That night the cabin felt smaller, the silence charged with unspoken questions. Jonas tended to the two men he'd disabled, tying them up loosely and leaving them on the porch with a jug of water. "They'll wake up with headaches and ride out," he said, dismissing them as a solved problem. The larger problem, Amos Sterling, remained. Lynn watched Jonas clean a small cut on his knuckles, the result of his encounter with the second man's jaw. He was clumsy with the rag, his large hands not made for such delicate work. Without thinking, she crossed the room, took the rag from him, and dipped it in the basin of clean water. He let her, his hand resting passively in hers as she gently cleaned the wound. His skin was calloused and scarred, but his touch was surprisingly steady. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the far wall. "I don't like Amos Sterling." "It is more than that," she insisted. "You invited a war to your door for a stranger." He was silent for a long moment. "I used to wear a badge," he said finally, the words costing him something. "U.S. Marshal. A long time ago." He paused as if deciding how much to say. "There was a family, homesteaders, murdered for their claim by a crew running illegal freight for the railroad. I tracked 'em for 6 months, got all of 'em but the leader." His voice grew tight. "The leader was the son of a territorial judge. When I brought him in, the judge buried the charges, buried my career with it. They put the word out that I was trigger happy, that I'd killed the others in cold blood. The reputation, it stuck." He looked at his hands. "It was easier to let people be afraid of me. Fear keeps men like Sterling at a distance." Lynn finished tying a strip of clean cloth around his knuckles. His story settled in the quiet room, explaining the weariness in his eyes, the precise violence, the isolation. He wasn't a killer. He was a disgraced lawman, living in a prison of his own making. "I have a contract," she said, remembering the papers in her trunk. She fetched the folded document. It was mostly in English, filled with legal language she didn't understand. She had trusted Sterling when he told her it was a simple marriage agreement. She handed it to Jonas. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the lines of text under the lamplight. His face hardened. He read it through once, then a second time, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Lynn," he said, his voice grave, "this isn't a marriage contract." He pointed to a dense block of text at the bottom. "This part here, it's an indenture agreement. You didn't just agree to marry him. You signed over your dowry as payment for your passage from China, and you agreed to work for him for 5 years to pay off a debt he invented. You're legally his servant." The words hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't an abandoned bride. She was property. That was why Sterling was so determined to get her back. Her testimony, her very existence could expose his entire scheme. He wasn't just cheating women. He was engaged in human trafficking under the guise of marriage. "He cheated you," Jonas said, his voice low and angry. "And he knows this paper proves it. That's why he can't let you go." A new kind of fear, colder and deeper, settled over Lynn. This was not just about one man's cruelty. It was about the law itself, twisted into a weapon against her. As if summoned by their words, the sound of hoofbeats returned, more numerous this time. Jonas moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. "It's a deputy," he said, his voice tight, "and Sterling is with him." This was the move he had predicted. Sterling hadn't come for a fight. He'd come with the color of law. The deputy, a portly man with a self-important strut, dismounted and strode to the door, a warrant in his hand. "Jonas Graves," he called out, "I have a warrant for the arrest of one Lynn, a bonded servant, for theft and flight from her legal guardian, Mr. Amos Sterling. Send her out, or I'm authorized to bring you in for harboring a fugitive." Lynn looked at Jonas, her last hope beginning to crumble. They were trapped. If he fought, he would be an outlaw, hunted for real this time. If he surrendered her, she would be dragged back to Sterling, her life a nightmare she couldn't escape. Jonas looked from the warrant in the deputy's hand to the contract on his table. He saw the cage the law had built around them both. He could run, take Lynn and disappear into the mountains, living like the animal they claimed he was. Or he could do the one thing they would never expect. He could walk back into the world that had cast him out and use its own rules against it. He made his choice. It would cost him the quiet solitude he had guarded for years. It would mean facing the system that had broken him. But looking at the small, determined woman in the gray silk dress, he knew he could not let them win. "We're not running," he said to her, his voice full of a resolve she had not heard before. "And you're not going with him." He turned toward the door. "We're going to the territorial capital. We're going to see a federal judge." 3 months later, the dust of the capital city, Carson City, felt different from the dust of the high desert. It was thicker, filled with the smell of coal smoke, commerce, and politics. Lynn stood on the courthouse steps, the summer sun warm on her face. She wore a simple dress of blue cotton, practical and sturdy. The gray silk was folded away, a relic of a past life. Beside her, Jonas Graves looked out of place in a borrowed suit coat, but he stood tall, the weariness in his eyes replaced by a sharp, focused light. The trial had been short. Jonas, using his knowledge of federal law, had bypassed the corrupt territorial courts entirely. The indenture contract was a clear violation of federal statutes passed after the Civil War. When presented to a federal judge, a man who owed nothing to the railroad or local politicians, the case against Amos Sterling had been swift and decisive. Sterling's entire operation came crashing down. It turned out Lynn was one of more than a dozen women he had lured with false promises, and his conviction was a certainty. Lynn had been the first to testify. With a translator at her side, she had spoken in a clear, steady voice, her gaze never leaving Sterling's face. She told her story, not as a victim, but as a survivor. The court had listened. Her dowry was to be returned, and her freedom was declared absolute. As they stood on the steps, a man approached them. It was Marshal Abernathy, Jonas's old superior, a man who had been forced to stand by while Jonas was disgraced. "Jonas," Abernathy said, his voice full of respect, "that was fine work. The kind of work a man with a badge ought to be doing." He held out a hand. "The offer stands. There's a star waiting for you, if you want it." Jonas looked at the marshal, then at Lynn. He thought of the quiet cabin, the lonely years. He had thought that was his life. But it had only been a long winter. "I'll think on it, Henry," Jonas said, shaking his hand. "I've got something to build first." 2 months after that, the frame of a new house stood on a piece of land 100 miles from Argenta. It was a homestead claim, filed jointly under the names Jonas Graves and Lynn Graves. They had been married by a circuit judge a week after the trial. Their plot was modest, with a creek running through a small meadow and a view of distant snow-capped mountains. Jonas was setting a fence post, driving it into the hard soil with powerful, rhythmic swings of a sledgehammer. The work was hard, but it was good work. It was the work of putting down roots. Lynn came from the half-finished house carrying a dipper of cool water from the creek. She watched him for a moment, the steady strength of him, the quiet purpose. He was not the fearsome gunslinger from the Whispers, nor the haunted man from the cabin. He was her husband. He stopped, leaning on the hammer, and took the dipper from her, drinking deeply. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Post is set," he said. "It is a good strong fence," she replied, her English now fluid and confident. He looked at the frame of their house, then back at her. "It's a good strong foundation." In her pocket, Lynn carried a small folded square of gray silk, a reminder of the woman who had climbed through a cabin window, terrified and alone. She was not that woman anymore. Jonas had given her shelter, but she had given him back a world he thought he had lost. A person's reputation, she had learned, was just the story that other people told about them. Their character was the story they chose to live, day by day, post by post. And their story was just beginning. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.